The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, this is the webinar for the Impact Management Toolkit created by Social Value Cymru as part of Mantec Gwynedd with Big Lottery funding. This webinar accompanies the Excel-based toolkit that's been produced and also the Word document that is a guidance document that provides further detail. So this webinar will provide an overview of the key elements required from a user to complete the Excel-based toolkit, and of course further detail is available in the guidance document. The toolkit is largely structured around the impact questions. These are the complete set of questions that Social Value Cymru, Social Value UK, Social Value International and other organisations identify as being able to provide a framework by which we can account for value and impact. That means being able to measure and manage the impacts of our activities. We'll go through each of these questions in more detail as we filter through the worksheets that create the toolkit. But essentially what we're looking at in front of us right now is initially questions that talk about what are the problem and the solution. So what is it we're trying to address and what are our activities? We then focus very much on the stakeholders, so those individuals or group of individuals that can affect or be affected by decisions and activities. And then we start to ask those stakeholders, what outcomes have they experienced or what are they likely to experience? And that does allude to the fact that we can use this toolkit for both forecasting and also a retrospective analysis of our impacts. So having identified those qualitative outcomes, those changes that people are experiencing or likely to experience, we move into the quantitative dimensions, impact questions 5 and onwards. Questions 5 and 6 ask us how we're going to measure those changes, which tells us how many people and also how much change per person has happened or again is likely to happen. We will ask questions about the relative importance of the different changes. We'll consider the duration of those changes and how much of each change is caused by our activities. Impact question 9 is very much alluding to this idea of impact, and impact, according to Social Value International, Social Value Cymru and others, largely means it's the amount of changes that an organisation can claim responsibility for. So how much of those changes experienced by people are a result of our activities, taking account of what would have happened anyway, the counterfactual or deadweight, and the attribution or contribution of others. Finally, impact question 10, which changes matter and are important enough for us to manage, is really the culmination of the other impact questions. And having answered those other questions, we'll be able to have that information that identifies which are the changes that matter most to the people whose lives are affected, and therefore those are the ones we should focus our attention on managing. Overlaying these impact questions are some important dimensions, one of which is thinking about who answers these questions. Largely, the answer to this question is those stakeholders whose lives are affected. So people with lived experience or those likely to have experience of changes should be those people informing us as to what has changed, how valuable those changes are, and how much has occurred, for example. Also, a really important point is this phrase of enough precision for the decision, essentially meaning that the evidence we obtain from asking these questions should be fit for purpose. That means it is simply good enough to inform the decision or decisions that we're trying to influence. So, for example, if we're wanting to affect government policy, which is going to affect thousands, if not millions of people in a very significant way, it's going to be very costly. It would also be very costly to reverse a decision. Then we're going to need high levels of precision. That could include things such as a very large sample size, using randomized control trials, and so on. Now, if alternatively we're looking to make an internal decision within an organisation, maybe at more of an operational level, then the level of precision required to support that decision is reduced. That's not to say that the data or the evidence is of poor quality, it's simply good enough. Again, enough precision for the decision. So as we go through this toolkit, please do not think that we need at all times highly rigorous scientific levels of evidence and data. We simply need enough data that is fit for purpose, again, enough precision for the decision. As a user, you will largely be able to answer that question with others in your organisation. Overlaying these impact questions are the principles of social value. These 7 principles, identified by Social Value International, again provide a flexible but consistent framework by which we measure and manage impacts. Essentially involving stakeholders to understand the changes that they experience. We also empower the stakeholders, amplifying their voice to allow them to inform us as to the value of those changes. The fourth principle, to only include what is material, is largely that 10th impact question around which are the changes that matter most to people and therefore those that we should manage. That's what we mean by material. They are both relevant, i.e. identified by stakeholders, our organisation, or perhaps a societal norm, and are also significant. And what we mean by that is that the magnitude of change, the duration, the amount of change, the value, and so on, is large enough to make it a material issue. If we were to exclude a material issue, it would affect the decision we take, so it is important enough for us to consider. As we've identified, perhaps not all of those changes are down to us. Some could have happened anyway, and some are largely down to the contribution of others. We have that principle, therefore, of do not overclaim. We will make judgments in social accounting, just as financial accounting does, but perhaps we'll make more judgments because we have less legislation, standards, and historic data to rely upon. So we have a principle that demands we are transparent. We will state clearly all of our professional judgments, allowing others to scrutinise those as appropriate. And that leads into the final principle, although they should not be seen as linear, more of a circle process. Verification of the result. Verification of the result, again, just as in financial accounting, is intended to provide the decision maker with enough confidence to use the results. Verification should at the least involve stakeholders, going back to those people whose lives are affected and asking them to provide some verification. Are the results truthful, accurate, and fair? If, however, we're wanting to go and present our results to external stakeholders, perhaps funders, commissioners, investors, for example, then verification should really include external and independent verification with assurance and audit processes available. So, moving into a bit of an overview of the toolkit process before we address each of the individual worksheets in turn. Initially, what we're looking to do is address impact questions 3 and 4. So we'll have the first worksheet that provides individual raw data. We'll talk about those well-defined outcomes shortly, but essentially we're going to look at identifying the characteristics of people and the outcomes they have or are likely to experience. This is qualitative in nature. We will then gather quantitative data, those impact questions 5 through 9, addressing the amounts of change, the value of the change, and how much we cause, that causality issue again. We will use this individual level data to create segments. These are subgroups or clusters of people based on their characteristics. This will help us better understand why people have different experiences when using our services. Perhaps our services are more effective for one group than another. Perhaps unintentionally, we create negative outcomes for a segment of stakeholders. Therefore, understanding the characteristics that help explain this will help us manage our impact, reducing the negatives and increasing the positives. We'll also set some targets at this stage. So again, just like financial accounting, we'll use some historic data and our own knowledge about the future, or our predictions about the future, and we'll set some targets for the amount of change that people are likely to experience. Having some targets means we can start to hold ourselves to account. So instead of asking that question of how much impact have we created, we're really moving the conversation to ask a question that says, have we created as much impact as we can or we expect with our resources? So to be able to do this comparison, we need to collect data about people we're currently working with, having used data from people who've used our services in the past, perhaps, to set those targets. So in worksheet 3, we will collect individual level data, but only focusing on one of those impact questions, understanding the amount of change people have experienced. Again, each of these will be dealt with in more detail as we go through this webinar. Worksheet 4 averages out those individual level pieces of data about the amounts of change and identifies the average amounts of change for each of our segments. This leads into the worksheet 5, where we compare the results. We will compare our impact monetary targets to those that we have achieved, being able to identify where potential improvements can be made. There is a sixth worksheet, as you can see on the bottom right-hand side of this slide, and that worksheet is not mandatory, but it provides further assistance in being able to identify the monetary value of our inputs, our financial and non-financial resources. So just as we will monetize or value the changes that people experience, if we want to do social return on investment, SROI, then we also need to monetize those inputs, again, the financial and non-financial resources. So going into the first worksheet, titled Individual Raw Data. The purpose of this is really to store data about individuals. It holds space for up to 100 individuals, although further rows can be inserted, as you can see on the worksheet. And importantly, the source of this data comes from one of 3 points, or one of 3 situations, very much dependent on our situation or the particular situation of you, the user. So it may be that you work with a group of people perhaps for a year, and then another group of people, or on a cohort-based approach. So for the first option, what we can do is speak to people who have previously used our service or used our goods and ask them about their experiences, asking them to look back perhaps over the last 12 months. We will then use this data to set targets for the next cohorts of people that we work with. The second option is perhaps when we're working with people for an extended period of time. So for example, this could be residential care for older people or children. What we'll do there is speak to those people and ask them about their experiences again over the last 12 months. But when we set targets, we'll be setting targets for the same group of people over the next period of time. The third option is perhaps where our activities or our services are completely new and we have no historic data. We have no people to turn to who have used our services. So we will speak to people who will use our services and ask them to forecast or to predict what will change for them. Now, of course, this may not be as rigorous or as reliable as speaking to people who do have experience of changes, but it is very important that we involve stakeholders even during the planning and design stage of any activities. So, moving into that first worksheet, what does it look like? Well, this is the first thing you'll face. These green columns and rows are really addressing that third impact question. Who are our stakeholders? Who experiences changes in focus? And we'll also start to address this issue about their characteristics. What is it about these people that helps explain the different experiences that people have? So when you first find this worksheet, individual raw data, at the very bottom of this, where the arrow is at the moment, it starts by talking about person code, and it's just 1 through 100. Person code can be edited, and this is just so that we understand how many people we're working with. Perhaps you have particular codes you want to include, that's perfectly fine. The next columns, where it says currently location, age, qualification level, etc., when you first see this, the titles of those cells will be characteristic 1, characteristic 2, through to characteristic 5. What we need to do here is edit those cells. So by selecting the cell where it says characteristic 1 and typing over, we can include characteristics that are specific to our people. Those in front of you at the moment, location, age, and qualification level, are just generic examples included for this webinar. But what we're saying here is that the location of where people live, the age of people, and the qualifications they have are likely characteristics that help explain why people have different experiences. So those are the 3 that have been included. There is the space for up to 5, but in this instance, we've only used 3 as the example. Now we need some of those specific options for each of those characteristics. So to input these, and again, those in front of you are based on these generic examples, you need to first of all highlight rows 6 to 11. At present, they're hidden. So what this means is when you look at this worksheet in front of you, you'll see it jumps from row 5 to 11, or rather row 5 to 12. Row 12, by the way, is just further information on each of those different headings on row 13. So to unhide the rows and be able to see rows 6 through 11, we need to use our left mouse button or our left keypad, select rows 5 and 12 and highlight both of those, and then use the right mouse button or the right keypad and select unhide. When you select unhide, those rows will appear, and we are then able to type in those specific options for each of the characteristics. So for example, where we have location as a characteristic, the specific options that are important in this example are whether people live in an urban or rural location. Now, of course, in reality, it might be that we want to use different examples. It might be that we want to use different counties within Wales, different towns or cities, perhaps. Again, with age, we have those different options, 16 to 18, 19 to 24, and 25 plus. And for qualification level, we have options of 1, 2, 3, or 4 or more. Again, these are just generic examples, and you really should include your own specific options and specific characteristics. When you've inputted these different specific options, I would again suggest that you highlight using the left mouse button or left keypad, rows 5 and 12, and select hide. This just tidies the worksheet and makes things a little bit easier. So we now have included information about our particular stakeholders. And of course, below those cells, we have people through 1 to 100. And again, it very much depends on your particular situation. You may have 100 people, you may have less than 100 people. And of course, we can use samples of individuals as well. So we will have information about those different people. And if I go back to that previous worksheet, or that previous slide rather, underneath location, we'll have person 1, we'll have row 1, and you'll be able to select using the drop downs the location. So person 1, for example, could be an urban person aged 19 to 24 with 2 qualifications. Again, we repeat that process for each of those individuals, and we create our profile of the people that we're working with. So still on the same worksheet, the individual raw data, the right-hand side of those green columns, which are identifying questions about our stakeholders and their characteristics, we're able to answer impact question 4, which are what are the outcomes that people have or are likely to experience. On this worksheet, there is space for up to 6 outcomes, where it currently reads in front of you, change levels of mental health. When you first see this worksheet, they are generic examples, and they are titled rather outcome 1, outcome 2, all the way up to outcome 6. To edit that cell, click on the cell and type in the words that are appropriate. In this case, we're going to deal with 2 examples. We're going to have the outcome of change levels of mental health, and shortly you'll also see a further outcome also introduced around change levels of isolation or loneliness. So that's impact question 4, and below that, we're also able to capture information about all the quantitative questions, impact questions 5 through 9. So the arrow on the left-hand side, where it starts number 2, and you need to select from the drop-down, this is answering impact question 5, which is how do we measure, or which indicators do we use to measure the change? So before we talk about any data from people, this question is very much looking at the outcome. So as it says, does an increase on the scale indicate a positive or negative change? So in this example, I'm assuming we're using an indicator of 1 to 10 to measure the amount of change in people's change levels of mental health. Now with this example, normally the best score, i.e. number 10, is the best. So if you're talking about somebody's mental health, if they score a 10, you could argue they're in perfect mental health, whereas if they score a 1, they're in a very poor situation. So again, looking at that question, does an increase on the scale indicate a positive or negative change? If somebody was to move up the scale, moving from, say, a 2 to a 3 or a 6 to an 8, that would indicate a positive change in that person's life. Therefore, where the left-hand side arrow is pointing, if we select that cell, we use the drop-down, there is 2 options, there is positive and negative. We simply, in this case, select positive, and that automatically filters down through all of the cells below in the same column. Now, alternatively, if we were to think perhaps of change levels of isolation and loneliness, ordinarily when we look at scales that measure loneliness, the highest score, again, let's say number 10, if we're using a 10-point scale, 10 is often the worst case. So if somebody scores a 10, if we're talking about a loneliness scale, then they're often regarded to be very lonely in the worst case, whereas 1 is indicating not very lonely at all. In this case, if somebody was to increase on the scale, again moving from a 2 to a 6 or an 8 to a 9, for example, that would indicate a negative change in that person's life. In that instance, we would therefore select negative, and again that would automatically filter down through the remaining cells below. This is really important. This cell, as a number of cells are aligned with the different calculations that are included within this toolkit, and this just ensures that when we come to identify the value of a change, a negative change is identified appropriately as having a negative value, whereas a positive change is regarded as having a positive value. So moving on to those other impact questions, we're going to go into impact question 6 now, and we're going to ask that question about how much change has happened. So first of all, we have the score on indicator before activities, our baseline. This is the score that somebody has in terms of their mental health before we start working with them. So again, in this instance, we're using a scale of 1 to 10, but the toolkit will allow you to use any scale you wish. Again, just in this example, we're using 1 to 10, where 10 is best. So person 1, this first row of data, they started on number 2, so 2 out of 10. Again, their mental health was not in a very strong position. After our intervention, after a period of time, we have the score on the indicator after the activities, the follow-up score. And for person 1, they have moved from a 2 to a 4, so the extent of change, those grey cells are automatically calculated and we cannot edit those. The extent of change is 2. They've moved from a 2 to a 4. Now, if that person had perhaps moved from a 2 to a 1, that extent of change would be recognised as -1. So the change levels of mental health, importantly, allows us to capture the both positive and negative changes. So that's impact question 6, the amount of change. If we then look to the monetary value, this is understanding how important, what the value of that change is. And the change is, of course, a 2-point change. Person 1 has identified the value of that change as being £1,500. The toolkit provides far more, or the guidance document provides much more information on how to identify the monetary values of our activities. Now, it may be that we decide we do not wish to use the monetary value of changes, and that is perfectly fine. This toolkit is automatically identified to use monetary values, so we have the pound sign, but if instead, or alternatively, we wish to use a scale of 1 to 10 in terms of the value, where 10 is most important and 1 is least important, we could still use 1 to 10. It will still appear with a monetary symbol, but again, we can just disregard that if we so wish. So the next cell is asking, is the change between the baseline and the follow-up negative? And again, these cells are grey, which means they're automatically calculated and is something that the user cannot edit. This cell is again one of those that helps us identify the appropriate calculation. So in this case, because somebody has improved, their mental health is increased. For both person 1 and 2, there's a positive change of 2 points. We have the change between the baseline and the follow-up being positive, identified as 1. If alternatively they had got worse, their mental health had deteriorated, what you would see there is -1. That cell affects the next one, which is the adjusted monetary value. Adjusted monetary value is doing exactly as what I've just indicated and saying, if it's a negative value, make sure we see it as a negative value. In this case, both of the pieces of data we can see in front of us, the adjusted monetary value is the same as the monetary value because these people have had a positive experience in terms of change levels of mental health. Again, however, if person 1 had moved from a 2 to a 1, with an extent of change therefore of -1, they would have valued that change as £1,500, i.e. that negative change was important. The adjusted monetary value would identify that as -1,500. Again, important for some of the calculations going forwards. The next two pieces of information around counterfactual and attribution are asking, first of all, how much of those changes could have happened anyway, and what is the contribution or attribution of others? So for person 1, what they're telling us is that there was a 75% chance that their positive change in mental health could have happened without us. Of the remaining value, what person 1 and person 2 are both telling us is that 50% of the value was created by others. So other individuals or organisations not involved in the contract or activity that we're analysing rather. The net monetary impact, that final column on the right-hand side, again greyed out so we don't need to edit this, is identifying per person the amount of value that our organisation is creating in this outcome. So for person 1, the change in their mental health, the value that we have created for that individual is £188. For person 2, the value that we have created through our activities is £125. This is repeated person by person, and again there is space on this worksheet for up to 6 outcomes, so we can really start to identify, even at this stage, where we are creating most value. Perhaps we're creating more value in change levels of mental health than in change levels of loneliness and isolation, or perhaps vice versa. All of the impact questions that we ask and get data and evidence regarding should provide us with insight. So immediately we could look at this data and say, perhaps we're creating negative change for people. Perhaps everybody we're working with, their mental health is reducing. Or perhaps more likely, it's different for different groups of people. So as we progress into this second worksheet, segments and target, that's very much what we're trying to do. We're trying to identify those different segments, those different clusters or subgroups of people, helping us better understand the people that we are working with. And again, based on their characteristics, how can we better understand why some people have different experiences to others? So this worksheet, first of all, has space for up to 6 different stakeholder segments, each with up to the space for up to those 6 outcomes that we've already identified. We will need to do some manual analysis based on the data we have in that first worksheet. Unfortunately, there's no way to do this automatically, bouncing from the first to the second worksheet, so we do need to do some analysis. Although I assure you, well, I hope so anyway, that it's not overly complex, and again, the guidance document does provide more information. So what we need to do is, using those drop-down filters on the first worksheet, is isolate different characteristics, asking ourselves a question of, what is it that helps explain people's different experiences? So in this case, we've identified a segment and we've titled this Young Rural People. When you first see this worksheet, that will say segment A, and you're able to select that cell and type over to make it something more appropriate to your particular activities. So again, in this case, we're saying there's something about young rural people. In particular, people living in rural locations, aged 16 to 24. Now, if we think about this, below there are other tables. So we could have segment B could become young urban people, for example. Again, people now living in urban locations, age 16 to 24. And we're able to segment, to cluster, to subgroup our stakeholders and understand those different experiences they have. So on the left-hand side of the table we're looking at, underneath outcomes, we have those grey cells, and grey again tells us we do not need to do anything. We have change levels of mental health and change levels of loneliness. Those are the outcomes we've included previously on worksheet 1, and they automatically feed forwards onto these tables. So we found something out about our young rural people. In terms of their change levels of mental health, the average amount of change they experience is 1. So on average, there is a positive improvement in mental health on a 10-point scale, in this example, of 1 point. If we look at change levels of loneliness, there's a change of 4 points. But again, our scale of loneliness, I know this can sound quite strange sometimes, and we do need to be very careful about this, but the change levels of loneliness people experience is their loneliness reduces by 4 points. So although it says -4, that is actually a positive change. Again, we do need to be quite careful about that. The next column, where it says if amount of change is negative, equals -1 to ensure value is calculated correctly. Again, it's one of those columns that is used to assist with the calculations in later cells and later worksheets. But again, if you look at this, change levels of mental health, the change is not negative, so we don't want to see -1, it's a positive change. But here we are seeing change levels of loneliness, we have the -1, and that ensures that when we do the calculations later, we have the appropriate corresponding value, in this case, a positive value. So for this segment of people, again, young rural people, aged 16 to 24, they have a 1-point increase in mental health on average, and the average value of that change, using the monetary value, not the adjusted monetary value, is £450. If we look at change levels of loneliness, the average value for that amount of change, a 4-point change, is £3,000. We have average counterfactual and average attributions. In this instance, both the same. We have 30% chance it could have happened anyway, and 40% contribution of others. What we now have, using this data, is the monetary value per unit of change. This information, if we take the £189, what this is telling us is, on average, for young rural people, for each unit of change, so for each 1-point movement, again on a 10-point scale using this example, the value that we create for those people is £189. When we look at change levels of loneliness, for each 1 unit of change, again in this case using a 10-point scale, the average amount of value that we create through our activities is £315. Again, this is fantastic insight. Young rural people, we create more value for them by addressing issues of loneliness than mental health. That could provide us with some information to help us think about changing our activities. Perhaps we could do more to reduce people's loneliness, because this is what people value more than their issues around mental health in this example. Now, again, we have those different segments, and perhaps young urban people, perhaps it's the same or perhaps it's different. Again, providing us with that insight that allows us to then say, what can we do differently? How can we change our activities to create more impact, to improve the well-being of people, and perhaps hopefully also reduce environmental harm and degradation? So on the same worksheet, we've identified our segments. We're now going to set some targets. So again, the data we have so far has come from one of 3 points or 3 sources. It's people we've worked with previously. It's people we will continue to work with over an extended period of time, or it's people who are forecasting their experiences, what they are likely to experience as a result of our work. What we're now going to do is use that information and say, well, over the next 12 months, what are our targets for that segment of people? So the table in front of you still relates to those young rural people. And what we're saying now is, let's set some targets. So again, just like financial accounting, what we're doing here is using some historic data based on our stakeholders. And we're also looking at our organization, our activities, using our own knowledge and experience to set some targets. The first thing we need to do is identify how many people we expect to work with in this segment. So again, young rural people in this instance, we're saying over the next 12 months, we expect to work with 25 of those people. The next thing we need to do, and hopefully this is where we start to see the toolkit becoming a bit more light at touch and we're starting to manage our resources around impact measurement and management, we only need to address one of those impact questions, which is how much change. So again, impact question 6. So first of all, the first arrow is pointing to the total or annual expected amount of change. So for young rural people, using the same indicator as before, again in this example a 10-point scale where 1 is the worst and 10 is the best for mental health, what's our expectation of change? So what we've identified here, again using that evidence and our own knowledge, we expect people to progress by 2 points over the year. In terms of change levels of loneliness, we have higher expectations and we expect to create 5 points worth of change over the annual period. But just like financial accounting, we're not just going to set annual targets, we will set quarterly targets. Now these quarterly targets, we've titled them reporting periods 1, 2, 3 and 4. It may be that you work with people over a shorter period of time, but we can still divide that period of time that we work with people into quarters. So reporting period 1 through 4, what we're saying here is, of that 2-point change for change levels of mental health, how do we expect that to occur over these different reporting periods? So for change levels of mental health, what the evidence is showing in front of us is that we do not expect to see any amount of change in the first or second reporting period. When we come to reporting periods 3 and 4, we expect to see a 1-point increase in each. Change levels of loneliness, that 5-point increase is split, as you can see, over those 4 reporting periods with 1-point change in periods 1, 2 and 3, and then a 2-point change in that 4th and final quarter. The final column on the right-hand side with the total or annual extent of change, where it's saying this should equal the same as the annual expected extent of change, is currently all in green. This is a bit of a traffic light system. If we see green, we've done things appropriately, and if we see red, we've made a little mistake. So this column is just a way of checking that those 4 reporting periods, the total of those, is the same as the annual expected amount of change. If for some reason we've expected a different amount of change over the 4 periods to our total, again it will be highlighted in red, just showing us that we need to revisit our targets. We've made an error. So we've set some targets. We've based this on historic data. We've understood the amount of change people have experienced, the value of those changes, how much we have caused, and identified the unit value of change. So again, for each point change, the value is X pounds. We've now said that we expect to see 25 people in this segment, and those expectations to the amount of change. So these figures in front of you, these impact monetary targets, are automatically calculated. So under where it says reporting period 1 monetary target, we have 0, 0, 4,725 and on. This relates to the first outcome, which again was changed mental health. The second row with data starting 7,875 relates to the outcome of changed levels of isolation or loneliness. So the top two cells, where we have zeros for reporting period 1 and 2, make sense. We had no expectation that there would be any change for our segment in that outcome for both of those reporting periods. Therefore, if we expect to see no change, we expect to create no value. Value for that outcome in reporting periods 3 and 4 is identified because we did have an expectation for some change to be experienced by those stakeholders. So we have this row by row for each of the outcomes, and we also have it added together or aggregated for those different reporting periods. We have now set social impact targets, just as we would with financial targets. So for this segment A, which are our young rural people, our total target for the year is around £49,000. What we're able to do now is hold ourselves to account. By having targets, we're able to ask the question of, have we created as much impact as we can with the resources? And if not, why not? What can we do differently? It's not about beating ourselves up. It's not about, firing ourselves or firing our colleagues for not succeeding. It's genuinely about a way of looking at our activities and saying, what can we do differently? How can we work differently with people to create more impact? So going forwards into the third worksheet, we're now going to start collecting data about people we're working with currently. So again, the data we have so far is based on historic data or again, people looking forwards. We now need to start collecting data ongoing to be able to compare. We're now collecting our actual data or actual evidence to compare to our targets. So first of all, very importantly, where the blue arrow is pointing, we need to select from the drop-downs in each of those cells. So again, this worksheet has space for up to 100 individuals. So person 1, from the drop-down underneath segment, when you hit the filter, the drop-down option, you will see young rural people, young urban people, and we select the appropriate segment. So person 1 you can see is a young rural person, person 2 is a young urban person. It is really important that we do make these selections, as beyond this point into the other worksheets, all the evidence and all the calculations are automatically done for us. If we do not select which segment our stakeholders belong to, it will be very difficult to do some of the following work. So going forwards, if we look at that young rural person, and this outcome in front of us still relates to change levels of mental health. To the right-hand side of this, we would have change levels of isolation and loneliness and any other relevant outcomes that have been identified for this stakeholder. So what this evidence in front of us is showing us is that we have a baseline. We have the starting score using the indicator. So this person's mental health, before they joined our activities, we asked them on the scale of 1 to 10 where they were, and they gave us a score of 2. So after 3 months, or that first reporting period, we repeat that question, asking about their mental health using the same indicator. In this instance, the person has said they're still at a score of 2. So the extent of change is therefore 0 for reporting period 1. Again, we repeat this process for reporting periods 2, 3, and 4, gathering the data at the appropriate times, and all of those extents of change, those grey cells, are automatically calculated. So with this impact management toolkit, worksheet 1 is where we're going to have to collect the majority of data. When we get through worksheet 3 and onwards, we're just asking that important impact question around the amount of change. We're able to do this in some cases because we have enough confidence that 1 year to the next, our stakeholders will experience the same outcomes. They are largely the same people, young rural or young urban people. Now, of course, in some cases, it may be that people have different experiences year upon year, which will mean that we need to revisit the qualitative, in worksheet 1, on a more frequent basis. This is very much down to the decision makers in the organisation, again reminding us of that phrase, enough precision for the decision. Moving into worksheet 4. So this is where our evidence is automatically calculated from the previous worksheet. So the previous worksheet, worksheet 3, had individual level data about the amounts of change. Worksheet 4 is averaging those results together for the segments. So again, very important that we have identified on worksheet 3 which segments those individuals belong to, and the evidence in front of you is largely automatically calculated. One thing we do need to include, however, is the number of people we have worked with over the period of time. So our expectation earlier was that we would work with 25 people, and that has been the case. Of course, that could be different in some circumstances. So the results in front of us show that for those two outcomes, for young rural people, the average amounts of change in reporting periods 1, 2, 3, and 4, and the total overall. So again, we have our targets. We've now collected all of the data we need ongoing about the actual amounts of change people have experienced. And we're now going to move into the fifth worksheet where we compare our results. So we are comparing our forecast and actual monetary impacts. Again, the vast majority of the evidence in front of you is automatically calculated from the previous worksheets. So just like financial accounting, we have our forecasts in front of us. We have this annual or total forecast, and that's broken down into those 4 different reporting periods. We have our actual results. The column in the middle, the positive +1 or negative -1, again, is one of those columns that really do assist with the calculations in terms of variance. So looking at our headline results, our total expectation, our total target for the year was to create around £58,000 worth of social value. If we look at the actual results, overall for the year, we've only created around £54,000 of social value. This is a variance of around £3,800 or 7%. Now that's really helpful information. What we're saying here is we've not achieved our targets. We can hold ourselves to account. But of course, we wouldn't wait until the end of the year to figure this out. So imagine the situation at the trustee meetings or the board level meeting. We would have this information during period 1. We would look at period 1 and we'd say, well, our target, our forecast was around £7,800. What was our actual performance? Oh, we've hit target perfectly. I'm sure that always happens. So in this case, there is no variance. The same occurs in reporting periods 2 and 3, where we hit targets. It is, however, in reporting period 4 where we failed to hit target. We're around £3,800 under, which for that reporting period is 15% variance. So again, this is that ability to hold ourselves to account, to ask that question or those questions of why did we not hit targets? Now, of course, for the first year or 2, it might be that we need to adjust our targets to make them more realistic to the situation and the environment we're working in. But if we accept these results in front of us, where we're saying the targets are reasonable, what we can say here is we have not achieved them. But the question is, why not? What can we do differently? We will interrogate these results with a bit more detail very shortly, because it's no good just knowing that we did not hit targets in reporting period 4. We need a little bit more detail. We can do one other thing with these results as well. If we include the financial value or the monetary value of the inputs, and again the financial and non-financial resources, we can also identify our social return on investment or SROI targets and actual results. SROI is calculated as total value created divided by total value of investment. So the £1.66 target or forecast is saying for each £1 invested, there is an expectation that we will create £1.66 worth of social value. Based on our results, based on the actual results of around £54,000, when we divide that by £35,000, the actual SROI, so for each £1 invested, only £1.55 was created. So this is a variance of 11p, again 7%. So this is really helpful headline information and can certainly be used to communicate to external audiences such as funders or investors, and is very helpful at that governance and strategic level decision-making area. However, again, the main purpose of this impact management toolkit is to allow organisations, social enterprises and others to use this information to make changes. So again, although we know we've not hit our target, we perhaps need a little bit more detail. On the same worksheet, this detail is provided. So just below those headline results, if we scroll down, we're also able to compare our forecasted actual amounts of change. So the table in front of you identifies each of our segments, and in this case, we only have 2 segments identified, those young rural or young urban people. Segment C through F we've not used, but of course we could have done. Now, we know we didn't hit target in reporting period 4, but the question is, was it everybody? Was it all of our stakeholders who did not experience the amount of change we expected? Or was it perhaps one or more of our segments? The data in front of us is highlighted in either green or red, so a very quick indication that it was actually young urban people where we failed to achieve our target in reporting period 4. We had a target of 3 points of change for all of the outcomes, but actually they only experienced a 1-point change. So again, this insight, this is the sort of gold dust that can help us target our resources. We're doing as well as we expected with young rural people. Let's keep doing what we're doing. But young urban people, there's something about that group of people that require us to act differently with them in reporting period 4 in particular, using this example. So again, this is the very purpose of the Impact Management Toolkit. Yes, we've got some good results and we can communicate those to others, but this is the insight that allows us to make some changes. The final worksheet, worksheet 6, is not a mandatory worksheet. It's just there to provide a bit of extra assistance. And this can help us calculate our total monetary input value. So to calculate SROI again, on the previous worksheet, we had to include that one piece of data around the input value. So input value, again, is financial and non-financial resources. So on the far left-hand side, you'll see financial resources. So this could be money from our own cash reserves. Perhaps we've got funding from the big lottery. Perhaps we've got other sources of income as well. We may also have some in-kind donations. Perhaps an organisation has donated a meeting room or meeting space for us. And we also might want to include the time and the value contribution of volunteers. If we have volunteers, we really should be including the contribution of their time as a monetary input. This will identify the total monetary value of the financial and non-financial resources, and we can use that result and drop it into the previous worksheet. Again, this worksheet here is non-mandatory. It's just there to provide a bit of extra guidance if necessary. That's it for the toolkit. So please do have a look at it. It is something that with practice becomes more familiar, but it is very much around helping us understand where we create most impact, helping us to identify where we can reduce some negative outcomes. Unintentionally, we may be making some people's lives worse, or perhaps making their lives worse in some outcomes. It also identifies where we can increase the positive outcomes. Again, perhaps using our example, we see we're really addressing issues around reducing isolation and loneliness. Perhaps we never even considered we were doing that. It gives us an opportunity to do more of it. And as well as providing the overall results, the overall impact results and the social return on investment, it's the ability to interrogate those results at different levels, interrogating at segment level for those different reporting periods and chasing it even further back and looking at an individual level. Different audiences, both within and beyond an organisation, will require different pieces of information. So funders more likely will want to see a headline results. Trustees and non-executive directors of an organisation, again, headline results, but with a bit more detail. And as we move through the organisation and we start to talk about project managers and operational leads, those people will need more and more granular detail. The toolkit provides all levels of detail to be able to support our decision making. This, of course, is not intended to replace our decision making. The purpose of the toolkit is to give us more information to help us make better decisions, to increase impact, ultimately improving the well-being of people, trying to reduce inequality and the environmental harm and degradation through our activities. So again, thank you very much. Further information, as I've said before, is available on the through the Toolkit guidance document, and please do have a look at the Mantec Gwynedd websites and Social Value Cymru Twitter account for more information. Thank you very much.